Hey guys, Scott here. A little while ago, we discussed what I thought were the best ships in FTL, the absolute monsters that just have that really high consistency rate when it comes to winning. And today we're going to explore the other end of the spectrum, the really, really trash garbage ships that just kind of suck. Before we get into it, we need to go over a couple of things to determine why they're bad, under what settings, and stuff like that. So we're going to start by assuming that we're playing on hard mode, where scrap is not as prevalent. We're not getting as much scrap from combats and events and just in general. And we're also playing on advanced edition as well, which can make a bit of an impact. Before we get to the actual 5, the worst, I've got an honourable mention for the Mantis C. Mantis C is interesting because it's one of those ships that, because it's a 4-man teleporter ship, it has that really snowbally effect going from the mid to late game. But in Sector 1, it plays more like the Federation C, where you don't really have any crew, and you don't really have any weapons, and you don't really have any defense. So it is very, very swingy from time to time. As soon as you see any enemy ship that has a med bay and a weapon setup that you need to take care of, it's just you need to make a choice, and you can't do two things at once. It's not like the Mantis A where you have a small bomb, or it's not like the Slug B where you have an Artemis missile. You have a stun bomb and a lockdown bomb, and the stun bomb is a 17-second timer for 1 point of ion damage. It's just kind of useless. So Mantis C, it can be really, really good later, but when you consider what it typically is like in Sector 1, which is the most important sector, which is the sector that we are going to be mostly focusing on, it's just kind of bad. It's just kind of bad. It does have some possibilities, but a few glaring weaknesses. So before we also get into the top 5, the other thing that I was thinking about recently is, how do we actually rate a ship? How do we fairly rate, how do we fairly talk about how good something is? And I think I came to the conclusion that the first thing we have to assume when we categorize ships from best to worst is we have to imagine that every ship is being played perfectly. Like, unfairly perfectly. Like, there is no mistakes being made. It's not even a person, it's AI playing FTL. So there are no mistakes. And once we have that basis, to get to our increasingly poorer and poorer consistency ships, it's about which ships are going to get rolled harder by RNG elements of the game. So a prime example is very, very hard for a ship like the Slug C to have a bad time in Sector 1, because you have hacking and mind control. Enemy weapons, just hack them! Mind control the guy inside, break that missile. And then we go to the other end of the spectrum, where Stealth B, any point of damage into your weapons and you're really screwed. So we assume every ship is being played perfectly, and then we are trying to figure out which ships are affected the biggest way by random elements of the game. So with that, we'll come in at number 5. My number 5 pick for the worst ships is Stealth C, and it's a really, really, I feel bad putting it that low, because the Stealth C does have a couple of redeeming factors. It has some really, really nice crew. Having a rock and a slug is really cool, because the rock in particular can get you quite a few good blue options, and having a slug pilot is really, really exceptional because they are immune to mind control. You also have some really, really good weapons. You have the 1-power charge laser and the mini beam. Mini beam being an absolute monstrous weapon. If we consider a world where a heavy laser is great, doing 2 damage for 1 power, the mini beam can do up to 4 damage. So it's really, really good. The weapons have a lot of potential. To a lesser extent, we also start with the system. We start with drone control. The problem with starting with drone control is that the drones we get at the get-go are pretty bad. The anti-drone is literally the most broken, and I mean poor, piece of equipment in the game where it actually doesn't really do anything at all. It has a really, really long charge up time before it fires at an offensive drone, and sometimes it just misses as well. I've had more than one occasion where we've instantly powered it after seeing an enemy beam drone, and it's fired an ion shot, and it's just missed. And it's bad. It's terrible. The overcharger drone is a little bit better, but honestly, it doesn't really do enough. It doesn't protect you from both weapons from the enemy ship. It might protect you from one, but the other one, if there's two weapons and they both do damage, one of them's going to hurt you. So the reason why the Stealth C can be so tricky to play is because it really depends on where your first store is located. If your first store in Sector 1 is located right next to you when you start, you're probably going to have a really, really bad time, because you are not going to have enough scrap to get those really important shields. The Stealth C doesn't have cloaking, like the Stealth A or B, and this means it just has the least defensive setup of any ship in the game. It has nothing. These drones that they gave it don't work. So if you can't get shields immediately because your store RNG was bad, then you're going to go through a whole sector of taking a lot of damage, which means that you're going to be spending a lot of money on repairs, and then you're also going to have to try to find a better store in Sector 2. And the same thing continues if your store is not located right at the start of the sector. So a lot of the Stealth C swingy nature comes down to, when did you locate your first store? If you see it at the end of Sector 1, that's usually like the best time, right? Because that's when you can sell off your crappy drones, and you can get your shields, and then in Sector 2 you've got some really amazing weapons, and you can kind of recover from there. But if you don't get that, it's just a really terrible time. And there's the really obvious issue of, without shields, you are really weak to any kind of beam, any kind of combat drone, any kind of beam drone, asteroid fields, solar flares. Obviously you have long-range scanners, which is a really big plus. It's probably one of the strongest pieces of equipment in the game, but sometimes you're just forced down these bad routes. And it's just, you can't ignore this. You can't ignore the no shields thing, the no defense thing. So that's why the Stealth C gets number 5. Next on my list, number 4, is the Rock A. The Rock A is pretty much a troll ship. It looks good on paper because it has 3 Rock crew members, and it has a couple of weapons, and it even has shields. Wow, very nice. But the problem with the Rock A is it's a ship that solely relies on having an option to move away from 2 missile weapons. And what we'll find is that having 2 missile weapons, there are a lot of enemy ships that require you to use a lot of them. And once you run out of missiles, damn, if you don't have any backup weapons that you've purchased already, you can't kill any ships anymore. And this is not uncommon. This happens a fair bit. And what will eventually happen is that after visiting your first store and finding nothing, then you suddenly need to change your game plan to making sure that your hull missile's doing 4 damage by firing on piloting with your Artemis, firing on an empty room with your hull missile, and that typically means that you're no longer hitting enemy weapon systems, so they're hurting you. We do start with 40 scrap with the rock plating. It's actually a pretty good ship when it comes to just pure scrap. Selling off both missiles and the rock plating, you actually get a bit of money. It's not bad in that respect, but the fact that you start with 2 missile weapons makes it very difficult to move into a more solid build. A lot of ships, they start with lasers or beams, and if you have one half of that equation, picking up the other half helps move you forward. But if you have to pick up both halves from the get-go, that's actually really tricky. So if you imagine we have to not only figure out, we not only have to get a store that offers shield breaking solutions, but also something that does damage to the ship as well. So you need really good store RNG to find those good weapons. And it's also really, really tricky because sometimes you may find a beam, but maybe you can't use that beam because you don't have anything to drop the shields. So if your first store has something like a pike beam, you can't quite go straight into that pike beam. You can't pick it up and be like, well, I got a pike beam, because it's not going to be very effective. You need to find a laser to go with it. And honestly, this just sucks. This is just such a annoying way to play the game, depending on depending on stores to be able to offer you an alternative once you're out of missiles. And we won't even talk about seeing Zoltan ships in Sector 1 that can actually eat about 6 or 7 of your missiles up. You only start with, I think it's 27 or something, and you might be like, 27, that's alright. But if it takes you 3 to 4 missiles to kill one ship, holy crap, at the end of Sector 1, you're pretty much empty. So, the Rock A, it's no fun. It's next on my list, coming in at the number 3 spot, we have the NGB. Obviously the NGB has some very glaring issues. 3 in my eyes. The first one being this singular crew status, where we only start with 1 NG. That's a pretty big deal. It's mostly a big deal because without the anti-personnel drone that you are supplied with, your NG actually can't 2v1 in the medbay. And if you fight 2 people in the medbay with your singular NG, you will lose. And that is a very, very big deal. And it's because the NG does less damage and gets overpowered by 2 enemy AI. And the heavy ion is also pretty bad as well. We never really want to be in a situation where against an enemy that has shields we need 100% of our 2 shots to hit, because it either means that the heavy ion will miss and your heavy laser does no damage, or the opposite will happen. The heavy ion will miss and the heavy laser will do no damage. And because you don't start with very good defenses on the NGB, except for the system repair drones, as soon as your ship takes damage, it's very hard to do repairs with 1 crew member. Because as soon as you move that NG out to go and do repairs on your ship, because you've been hitting the shields or you've been hitting the weapons, all your piloting is gone, all your evasion. And even though it's not very much, it still makes a big difference, and it still stops your FTL from charging. So as soon as you move that NG out of that room, it's like, geez. And there are just some fights where you'll literally never hit the enemy, because out of your 2 shots, you need both of them to hit. Once again, we have the repeated issue of drone control as well, where I think drone control is probably one of the weakest systems in the game. Offensive drones are not worth it, because they can be shot out of the sky, they consume a drone part, they're mostly ineffective, and they're really expensive to power. The only drones we ever want to use with drone control are typically defense drones, specifically defense drone 1, because it only targets missiles, and hull repair drones. But hull repair drone is 85 scrap, and that's 85 scrap you could be spending on something that just kills an enemy ship faster, so you don't take that damage. So drone control, it's mostly a waste of system, and if you don't find that defense drone, man, it sucks. It feels bad. So those 3 issues, the crew, that heavy ion, and the drone control, they kind of suck. And when we compare the crew situation on the NGB to other ships, if we start with 3 crew members and we pick up 3 crew members, then by the end of the game we have 6. That's pretty good. That's a good amount of crew. We can do stuff with that. But if we start with the NGB and we pick up 3 crew members, we actually have 4. And 4 is... it seems okay, but when you have 4, that's 1 pilot, 1 engine guy, 1 weapon guy, and 1 shield guy. That leaves nobody to do repairs on a fire, or it leaves nobody to fight intruders, and when you have to take people off of manning systems to go and do things, then that's where you start to feel a bit weaker, when your weapons charge slower and you lose evasion. So you need to get more crew than another ship typically would to kind of get to the same level. These next 2, these are miles ahead in crapness compared to the first 3 I just mentioned. They're just way far away. They're just right down, bottom tier, super junk, massive garbage. Would not invite to Christmas party. They're trash. Second worst ship in the game, in my honest opinion, is the Federation C. Federation C is just utter junk, because as we discussed with the Mantis C, you have nothing to shut down enemy systems in Sector 1. You have a flak artillery built into the ship, but that fires after 50 seconds, and it can miss. It's so much worse than the beam artillery from Federation A and B, which automatically hits and also does damage through shields, which is actually not too bad at all. But the Federation C, waiting 50 seconds for something that might not even take down an enemy medbay, is really, really trash. And there'll be so many ships in Sector 1, any drone ship, any ship with Zoltan shields, any ship with a medbay, any ship with a missile, you are severely behind. And you will take so long to defeat these ships, you're going to rack up damage. Just turns out not starting with any kind of weapon is a huge disadvantage. It's a huge disadvantage when you have no tools at your disposal to stop the enemy offense or to end the battle, to end the combat. And the other thing with the Federation Sea is, even though we have decent crew and the layout of the ship is not too terrible, we have some decent venting. Because of that artillery and teleporter, transitioning into the late game, you only have room for one more system. And that system will typically be cloaking, because it's the only defensive system that suits the ship. Drone control doesn't really suit the Federation ship very well because they're such big ships. Drones are kind of a bit janky on them, that it doesn't work so good. And because you only get cloaking, what you'll find is that your weapon setup will need to be better than normal to actually have any kind of effect, or you'll need to make use of that artillery. But once again, that artillery, to make it actually useful, to get it up to 20 seconds, which is around the time of a typical Flak 2, it's a big scrap investment, so it just kind of sucks to have to use that as your shield breaking mechanism. Just the artillery is a huge detriment to your ability to be efficient. It's just not built to be efficient at all. And that leaves our number one spot, the worst ship in the game, without a doubt, is the Stealth B. Stealth B is just an absolute hunk of crap because in entirety, the glaive beam, having no shields and a 25-second charged time weapon is trash. For 25 seconds, you have to withstand enemy fire with no shields, and as soon as your glaive beam takes 1 point of damage, it's going to go all the way back down to 0, you're going to have to repair it, and then you're going to have to wait another 25 seconds, and guess what? Enemy weapons don't wait that long. You are supplied with cloaking, but you don't really get high enough engines for that to be almost effective. Until you get level 3 cloaking with your Stealth B, you can't always rely on cloaking to even dodge shots. The amount of times I've been shot through cloaking into my weapons is just absolutely frustrating, and it's the worst feeling to just know that, well, if I get hit, I'm probably going to lose this game. And then again, there are some things that are just completely unavoidable as well. A great example of this is a mini beam. Before level 3 cloaking, an enemy mini beam will always hit you. There is no way to get around it. It is always going to hit you. So if that just meanders over into your glaive beam, it's over. That fight is just gone. And the glaive, the Stealth B is just, it's so scrap intensive, and it's so, there's no deviation from one of two plans when you play the Stealth B. The Stealth B basically boils down to you get charity and you scramble together a win, or you have a really hard time and you lose. But there is also a third category which we're slightly learning at the moment. It's a different playstyle of the Stealth B. Did make a video about it last week, a new kind of build order. But it really sucks to not really have any kind of options, and just kind of hoping that, you know, geez, I hope they don't have a mini beam. Geez, I hope I get enough scrap. Geez, I hope my sector layouts are good. You know what I mean? It's just too much hoping, and there's not enough player control. There's just too many variables that are out of the player's control to make the Stealth be like a decent ship. It's crap. The layout as well. Bonus, a 2-slot medbay where, because it's located to the north of the ship, you can't even really rotate crew through there properly. Having 3 crew on the ship is like, okay, but honestly, that Zoltan, man, if you try to move it out of if you have it powering your glaive beam and you need to move it, damn, that glaive beam's getting depowered. If you have it in your cloaking for the same reason, it's just bad. I think Zoltan are one of the weaker races, so anytime I get a Zoltan, I just shove him straight into the engines where he's not going to be moving ever. And it's just a really poor ship. Even the venting sucks. So, because of that, because there's so little player choice and player interaction with the Stealth B, and it's mostly just rolling dice and hoping, It's just the worst ship in the game. There's too many things that can go wrong. So there you have it. Those are my top 5 worst. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of difference of opinions about what deserves to be on this list and what doesn't. I simply just took the 5 that I felt had the most glaring issues and tried to put them in order there. Anyway, let me know what your worst 5 are as well. I'd love to hear your opinions on why something is terrible or why the ships I mentioned aren't so bad. And yeah, I'll catch you next time.